The United States government has had an economic, commercial, and financial embargo on Cuba since 1962, with 80% of the population never knowing a life without it. This has resulted in 60 plus years of devastation for the Cuban population, affecting their overall human development. Miraculously, they've still managed to achieve one of the highest human index scores south of the US border, which is insane. But not without severe consequences for nations and businesses who do try to trade, engage, help, or invest in Cuba, as you can see behind me. The US is consistently targeting foreign banks and companies who try to trade with them, and we're making millions to billions in the process. The US government has been doing everything they can to create the illusion that it is somehow socialism in Cuba that is hurting the Cuban people. They want you to think that people are suffering in Cuba because of socialism. I'm going to tell you why that is not the case. People are actually suffering because of 65 years of economic, financial, and commercial sanctions imposed on them by the US government. We call these sanctions the embargo. Now I'm going to explain to you how this embargo is targeting the Cuban people. And I'm going to start with the Cuban Assets Control Regulations Act, which is part of the embargo. This policy basically targets not only individuals but also financial institutions who make any type of payments, transfers, or withdrawals of any kind with Cubans. This devalues Cuban's currency progressively over time, making it practically worthless outside the island. This in return forces Cubans to be dependent on tourist money to make international payments and purchases. So they literally have to wait for foreigners to come to Cuba so they can exchange currencies, so they can take that foreign currency to get around the US embargo to make international payments and purchases to get things that they need to survive, which is crazy. Anyone who is wondering why the government spends so much money on tourism and hotels, that is why. It is literally their lifeline to generating revenue. We are forcing them to do that, which takes away from other sectors that need to be restocked, such as healthcare and food, which creates life-threatening conditions for Cuban citizens. So now that you understand that tourism is their lifeline, understand now Trump and Marco Rubio got together and made it illegal for Americans to stay in these hotels the Cubans created for tourists. They also made it illegal for Americans to bring back rum, sugar, and tobacco from Cuba to America, which further prevents and screws the Cuban people out of the possibility of obtaining the foreign currencies they desperately need. And it doesn't stop there either. The Torricelli Act, passed by Democrat Robert Torricelli, goes on to state, if a nation gives a certain amount of aid to Cuba, the US will cut off that same sum of aid and add it to their debt, basically by denying them debt reduction or forgiveness, which is an insane thing that they can do because most of the world is still under IMF and World Bank debt traps. This sanction also goes on to target shipping companies. Shipping companies who dare to dock in Cuba are forbidden to dock in US ports. So this basically targets international shipping companies as well, basically threatening them to not stop by Cuba to drop off goods and services. If they do, they can no longer stop at US ports. But now we got banks, shipping companies, and countries who cannot interact with Cuba freely because of the US embargo. And does it stop there? Of course not. So if a foreign business does go ahead and they find a shipping company that will go to port in Cuba and drop off goods for them, and they trade with the Cubans, then they will be subjected to what is called the Helms-Burton Act, which basically sanctions and fines foreign companies who trade with the Cubans in Cuba. They get sanctioned basically because their companies will no longer be able to trade with US companies. Their executives can get on a blacklist, preventing them from ever entering the United States again. So now let's think about this. You get to determine whether you want to trade with the United States of America, the largest consumer spender market in the world, or Cuba, an embargoed island nation. That should be a no-brainer for most companies in the world, given all the restrictions and risks that come with trying to trade with Cuba. I want you to consider this as well. Cuba has lost trillions over the last 6 decades because of this US embargo. They struggle to pay back those who will trade with them, and they lose upwards of $5 billion annually. And that's dollars. Think about this. $1 US is 250 Cuban pesos. The average Cuban lives on 3,000 Cuban pesos a month. That's $12 a month. That's $3 a week. Think about that. $3 a week. Now think about this. If the state budget is $3 to $4 billion for 10 million people and the embargo is costing them $4 to $5 billion, then they are losing more than half of their value to the embargo directly. Imagine your standard of living being half of what it is right now. Would you even survive? Think about that. They would literally thrive without this embargo. Think about how devastating it is for the Cuban population. And that is the point of it. Look, that's Lester D. Mallory, a U.S. diplomat who stated this 6 decades ago, that because there is effectively no political opposition to the Cuban Revolution, the U.S. government is going to take every possible means to weaken the economic life of Cuba by making the greatest inroads in denying money and supplies to Cuba to decrease monetary and real wages, to bring about hunger, desperation, and the overthrow of their government. So the U.S. is deliberately attacking the Cuban people by driving them into poverty, hunger, and desperation with the goal that hopefully it'll drive them against their socialist government and create a civil war that will result in a revolutionary overthrow. Think about how insane that is. This embargo has been going on for 65 years now. It's not even like any of their leaders are alive anymore, or in power for that matter. They haven't been at war with anyone, yet the U.S. still has them under the Trading with the Enemy Act, an act that's intended for countries we're currently at war with. And of all the countries we're currently beefing with around the world, Cuba is literally the only country on that list. Now you may wonder, why hasn't anyone spoken out? And every single year they do speak out. Nations all over the world gather in the UN and the General Assembly and vote overwhelmingly to end and lift the embargo on Cuba. Every single year for 31 years now, and it almost always looks like this. Every single country voting to end it, with the same 2 countries saying no, the US and Israel. So why is the US government so hell-bent on consistently inflicting all of this unnecessary death and suffering upon the Cuban population? Is it because their socialist model stands as an alternative to capitalism? Maybe because without the embargo they'd only thrive, which could inspire socialist action all over the planet, so that could very well be. Because Cuba's healthcare system is considered to be amongst the best in the world, with more doctors per capita than any other country on the planet. It's free to access to anybody, no matter where you come from, and they're routinely sending doctors all over the place to help people in times of need, sometimes for free. They've even offered to send doctors to the US a couple times. And their educational system is known as one of the best in Latin America, according to the World Bank, and it's free to the highest level, not only for Cubans, but for foreigners as well, with many, including Americans, graduating with medical degrees from Cuba. They also have one of the highest literacy rates in the world. And there's practically 0 homeless people in Cuba as well. Yes, 0 homeless people, because housing is a constitutional human right and landlordism is abolished. This has resulted with 80% of their population owning their own homes. Those who don't own yet are most likely still on a waiting list, waiting for one to be built or provided to them, or they still live with their parents still. Cuba also has one of the lowest unemployment rates in the world as well, with about 62% of the population working in the public sector and the other 38% either working independently or in a worker-owned cooperative. Together, they both help finance the state budget, where 72% of it goes right back into financing social freedoms for the entire population. And the rest of it is spent on various other sectors such as defense and tourism, their lifeline. Now keep in mind, this is an underdeveloped island nation that has been struggling and fighting for 60 years against a commercial, financial, and economic embargo. And they've managed to do all of this. This is why the U.S. refuses to lift the embargo, because Cuba would thrive and make the U.S. look horrible. Because we're the richest country in the world, with 500,000 of our own citizens sleeping outside of storefronts begging for food and money, with tens of thousands more dying every year because they can't afford health care or the insurance that comes with it. Not to mention there's millions more who are struggling due to crippling school debts. A thriving Cuba would not only stand as a slap in the face to the American working class, it would stand as a powerful example to the nations of the global south. Because if Cuba's allowed to control their natural resources and labor power, then nations throughout the global south will want to do the same thing, which is a threat to capitalist and Western nations who are exploiting the natural resources and labor power throughout the global south. For this reason, they want to see the Cuban people suffer, and they want them to blame their government for it. They also want to make sure that the rest of the Latin American countries and global south countries in general stay in line and fear the idea of nationalizing or socializing their natural resources or labor forces. This is the idea behind the embargo. Now, if you want to do something to help the Cuban people and their development of socialism, you can look for non-profit organizations that are sending them food, medicine, and other materials that they need. You can also help by sharing this video to help spread awareness about the Cuban embargo and its effect on the Cuban people. Because about every single topic I listed above, although it sounds amazing, is in a constant stage of shortage because of the embargo. Cubans are constantly facing shortages, and it's getting worse every single day. It's unnecessary, and if you're still wondering why, listen again.